Good morning or good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us from across the world. It's fantastic to see you here. My name is Catherine Grayson. I work for the ICRC as a policy advisor, and I'm joined by David Fisher, head of IFRC's Policy and Diplomacy Unit, by Martin van Aals, the director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, and Bruno Jolicoeur, director of the Climate Action Accelerator. We're thrilled to have, I hope, 30 minutes. I hope we're not being asked to do this in 15 minutes. We're thrilled to have 30 minutes ahead of us for a conversation on the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations and on its implementation. Here's the plan. David and I will briefly introduce the Charter. Martin will then reflect on implementing the Charter and in particular its first commitment, that is to step up our response to growing humanitarian needs and help people adapt to the impacts of the climate and environment crisis. And Bruno will then turn to the second commitment and discuss the reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions. And we will hopefully have 15 minutes left to discuss after this. So let's get started. What is the Charter? I'm hoping each and every of you have had the chance to read it and has received it by now. The Charter sets out 7 commitments that aim to galvanize and steer humanitarian action in response to the climate and environment crisis. It was open for adoption last Friday, and some 10 organizations have already signed it, and we hope many more will join in the coming weeks and months. The Charter stems from the recognition that we have a responsibility as humanitarian actors to scale up our ambitions to respond to the climate and environment crisis, and that working together is essential to respond adequately. It is the result of a collective effort across a wide range of humanitarian organizations. The effort was led by the ICRC and the IFRC with the support of an amazing advisory committee. The Charter is for the whole sector, just like the 1994 Code of Conduct for Humanitarian Organizations. So the short history behind this is that in 2019, we saw the need for agreeing on common humanitarian ambitions to respond to the crisis. And at the last Red Cross Red Crescent International Conference, we took a pledge with the IFRC to work to develop this Charter. We started developing it last summer with the support of an advisory committee, as I was mentioning, that's bringing together 19 climate and environment experts and representatives of humanitarian networks. And ICVA there played an important role as part of the advisory committee, as they very actively supported the development of the Charter, and they helped us organize a number of regional consultations with their membership. The final text that David will be presenting in a minute is the result of a deeply consultative process. From December last year to March this year, we held consultations on the draft text, and we received overwhelming support and incredibly useful feedback from over 150 humanitarian organizations, ranging from national societies to small local NGOs and large international ones and UN agencies. It was important for us to hear from a wide range of organizations because we wanted to capture their perspective and reflect the reality that the humanitarian sector is made of different organizations with very different mandates and capacities. Now, as we opened the Charter for signature last Friday, we are looking into disseminating the Charter, engaging with many humanitarian organizations, and we hope to have a large number of signatories before the COP, so we can share it to convey our commitment to address the issue. In parallel, we're now working to develop some guidance on the implementation of the Charter. We're working on identifying useful tools to implement the Charter, and we're working to connect with the right networks to support that implementation. I'd stress that this is in fact the beginning of a process to adapt humanitarian action, and you will hear more about that in the next few minutes. Before turning to David to speak to the content of the Charter, I'd just like to highlight that we're completely aware that there are transition costs attached to implementing the Charter. pertaining to reducing our footprint, but also to adapting our programs. And the conversation with donors, but also with experts who can help us improve our response will be absolutely essential throughout this process. David, passing you the floor on the content of the charter. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to ICVA for the great cooperation throughout this process and for inviting us to this event. I'm just trying to share my screen. Can someone let me know if it's working?
It is working.
Oh, thank you. So, as Catherine said, I'm David Fisher. I'm with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and we've been working very closely with Catherine and her team at ICRC and with a lot of other actors on this document now for quite some time. Hopefully you have the document in front of you, but basically it has two main areas of commitment. And the first one, as Catherine mentioned, is about stepping up our response. So this is a combination of doing some traditional things better and at higher volume, given the changes and the extended growing humanitarian needs coming out of the climate crisis, but also doing some things in a new and different way. And that includes understanding what we know about climate change and what the science tells us about it, and being able to use those things in an effective way to reduce the impacts on people's lives, negative impacts that people have to suffer through. A couple of things that are emphasized here are disaster risk reduction, which is traditional for many of us, but also adaptive action, moving fast, being able to spend and to program as fast as possible based on information that we know, for instance, climate forecasts. This, of course, is not just about climate; it's also about environmental crisis, and so it's also a process of education for our sector about how we can do no harm in both areas. And the second area of commitment is about us walking our talk. So we've been increasingly vocal as a sector about the impacts of the climate crisis, and we are not the most polluting industry in the world, but we can definitely do our part, and we really must if we expect others to do their part. So there's been quite a lot of work in the past. There's been all sorts of piloting and that kind of process, but for some of us, it's still a new process to be measuring ourselves and to be giving ourselves ambitious goals when it comes to greening our own operations. And it is possible. It's even possible in the midst of an emergency operation. And that is the goal here, that we should take the steps that are necessary to be as green as we can. The other points that are included in the charter are generally in support of one or both of these two main commitments about the kinds of things that humanitarians can do about the climate crisis. So one of those things is that we must put at the center the people themselves that are affected by the climate crisis, and that we should be empowering and supporting the leadership of local responders and communities themselves in our efforts to address the humanitarian impacts of both climate and environmental crises. The second is that we need to understand what the new world is that we're facing, and how to use evidence in a better way to be more precise in the way we do our work. We've already gone over my limit. We need to work collaboratively across our sector, but also outside of our silos. So we need to work with development friends, we need to work with environmentalists, we need to work with academia, we need to kind of widen our networks so that we can play our best role. We have an ambition in here to raise our voice. This isn't just something that we are silent about. We need the international community to know what these humanitarian impacts are, and we're in a pretty good position to share some of that because of our programming and our presence. And finally, there's an ambition here to develop and improve our own targets and standards, and to be conscientious and systematic about this. The Charter acknowledges that not everybody is in the same place on this. And so it's not expected that the first day you sign the Charter that you have your baseline all set and that you know exactly what your target is. But it sets off the ambition. And then there is an intention that you should, in a short amount of time, at least within a year, come up with your targets that make sense in your circumstances. And as Catherine Lund pointed out, we'll have some models and guidance to share, but it will be for each signatory to decide what those targets are. So with that, I'll stop and I guess hand over directly to Martin. Does that make sense?
Sure. Thanks, David. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, we do.
I will give you a few insights on what the interpretation of the first targets, which is really to improve our work to address these risks in practice in our humanitarian work, what that might look like. And I think it's important what David emphasized just now, that this is not a binding, rigorous set of targets that will be enforced on each of the organizations signing. A bit like those of you who are familiar with the Paris Agreement on climate change, where you have nationally determined contributions for each country to enable each country to do what makes sense in its own context. But at the same time, have each country consider that in the context of a broader global aspirational goal. And also with the expectation that those aspirations will go up over time. So this is where you can take a first step and then move forward along the way. The first thing on the first target, which is dealing with those risks, is that we are playing a very important role. Humanitarians are already at the front lines of the rising risks. In that sense, we have an important role diagnosing the issues that are already confronting the world in terms of rising climate and environmental risks. But just being there at the receiving end, of course, is not enough. So there are a few additional things that you can commit to, and I think the target already provides a number of elements there. A greater focus on risk assessment so that you see what you might be able to anticipate. And again, this is not always easy. It's actually much easier to anticipate, for instance, what is changing in the climate in rich countries, like those of you now in Geneva, excellent weather data, cool climate scientists who've been studying with the models what's happening there with the weather for a long time. Even there are uncertainties, but way smaller than in most places where we face. So it's where we work. So it's partly also then developing the ways of working to deal with that rising volatility, the rising uncertainties, and factoring that into your program. So a target might simply be, we commit to thinking about this, to being rigorous about how we address this rising volatility in our programs on the ground. An additional component, as David mentioned, might be a more deliberate investment in addressing the risks that we face over time. So not just being prepared to respond to that rising risk that we see in those risk assessments, but also to think about what we can do ahead of time in terms of disaster risk reduction, in terms of what we know is coming as a general pattern, but also better anticipating risks. So for instance, making better use of forecasts to then act ahead of time when something is happening. And to think about what is happening to the natural resources base and how some of the interventions that we do in a humanitarian context may have a trickle back on future risks that communities are facing. So all of this is about thinking what makes sense in your context and then developing a target which can be quite a process-oriented target in the first place. So it could be a number of people that you intend to serve with better risk reduction. It could also be a target along the lines of the percentage of your programs that you will screen for changing risks, develop risk assessment for each country where you work, and be systematic in how you analyze the risks for each program. I'll leave it here in light of time because I think we should leave some time for discussion and hand over to Bruno for the second target and what we can do to contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gases in the adoption of this charter. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you hear me well? Yes.
Yes.
My name is Bruno Jolicoeur. I'm the director of a new non-for-profit initiative called the Climate Action Accelerator, and here I'll focus really on how to get from words to action on the side of mitigation, and notably reduction of the carbon footprint or environmental footprint of organizations. And with this idea that, you know, in the face of the emergency, we know there's a need for a surge in the commitments and action of organizations in the aid sector, but also many other sectors like the health sector, the education sector, and others. So what is this initiative about? It's really about it's really about operationalizing climate action for organizations, and with a first pillar, which is helping organizations to set the right targets and to actually construct the roadmaps, the action plans that are going to enable them over the next 10 years to halve their emissions by 2030. And so it's really based on, you know, science-based targets. We're in the mainstream of the curbing down of emissions, but we think humanitarian organizations can't aim for targets that are actually less ambitious than states that have signed up to the Paris Agreement. So this first pillar is really about assembling the resources, the experience, the technical support to work in partnership with organizations and, you know, provide them the tools to get them on this trajectory. The second pillar is about how to turn these organizations into vectors of change within the ecosystem, the aid ecosystem. So to get more organizations on board, because we know that replication of commitments and actions is actually, you know, the condition for success in terms of climate action. And the whole idea is to try to contribute along other initiatives to a domino effect in the aid sector in this regard. And the third pillar is about, you know, putting in place a community of practice, which is actually sharing solutions as an open source common good, free of access to everybody, and whereby, you know, tools, experience can be basically shared between organizations that are advanced, those that are less advanced, and this itself plays an accelerating role. And so why is this important? It's because aid organizations not only have a responsibility, as it's been said this morning and just before, but they also have a great amplification role in society along other institutions to actually help reach social tipping points. And I think it's very important for organizations that are on the front line of actually needs and impacts for populations to be actually walking the talk and participating to this collective effort along the right targets. Maybe I'll finish on where the key added value is. The key added value, for me, it's really about, it's operationalizing, it's replicating commitments, it's taking stock of a multi-sectoral community. Here, the idea is not to have just aid working in silo, but it's also trying to get all the good experiences from also other sectors, whether it's companies, whether it's health, education, etc. And it's really, I would say, moving away from what is essentially, private consultancies towards low carbon strategies to actually a shared good where very relatively quickly we can take stock of all the good experiences and make them available with the tools so that organizations can jump on. Maybe last thing is to say that this initiative is about 6 months old. It started at the beginning of the year. We have about 10 organizations today on board, among which the ICRC, but also Médecins Sans Frontières, Alima, the Terre des Hommes movement, and a few others. And it's also it's an open initiative, and we will welcome any organization interested in gaining more information or becoming a partner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruno, Martin, David. I'm delighted to say that we've been granted an extra 15 minutes, which gives us a bit of space for a discussion. I'd invite anyone who would like to react, ask questions, share experience or challenges in integrating climate and environmental risks into our work to take the floor. And we actually have a question in the chat box that I think, Martin, if that's fine with you, I would give you the opportunity to respond first. It's a question about resilience and experience or a practice related to resilience building initiatives, looking at socioeconomic aspects. I was wondering if you'd have anything to share about this.
Yeah, thanks, and a great question. Now, of course, the first thing to acknowledge is that resilience is an attribute of people. So it's also extremely contextual, and it's about their capacities rather than just something that you dump at them or that you can provide as, you know, food or water. Or all those things are part of it. But it's, I mean, the literal interpretation is sort of being able to bounce back. So it's acknowledging that there are more shocks coming our way, and it's thinking about how people can be better able to deal with that. There are, I think, no standard practices that you could say this will work everywhere. In humanitarian context, we actually know that it's one of the most challenging things. And some people have even questioned whether resilience is the right word. We think of the resilience of a community in a challenging context, then it's probably a good thing that they're resilient. But in many cases, the patterns that we see playing out in humanitarian contexts are resilient to change, and that's not a good thing. You know, some regimes are resilient to change, and maybe there's a need for shifts over time. Are some of our practices, including very environmentally unfriendly practices, are terribly resilient? So we need to think about what sort of resilience. But then if that resilience is indeed formulated as the ability of people in challenging circumstances to cope with shocks, then if you look at it with that lens, it is the local people or those people providing services in those local contexts that really know what is needed. It's often not rocket science either. You know, many of your colleagues working at the front lines in the field will know what sort of things are needed. But it's a mindset of not just dealing with every single shock, responding to it, providing what's needed at that point, but thinking about what is needed over the longer term as a journey. If you, the person asking the question there, if you have a specific context in mind, there are many examples of programs that are starting to do this. So I'm happy to send you some examples, but I'm also actually very hesitant to tell anyone what to do because I recognize that a lot of the experience is actually on the ground. The localization agenda on the humanitarian side is an important component of this as well. It's about empowering people to actually have the resources, to have the knowledge, but also the resources to take the actions they themselves can take to reduce that, to increase that resilience. And that's partly also the awareness of how some of their own activities may sometimes be destroying resilience. And that is also that interplay with the environment, where you see that some short-term coping strategies can actually be maladaptive or resilience harming in the longer term. And that's also where our humanitarian work can better support people to not just deal with the shock right now, but also be more resilient and thrive in the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Bruno, I think I'd let you take the next question, and I'm happy to complement from the ICRC side in terms of work being done in that regard. But there's a question about did you say that you're going to share a methodology for carbon footprint calculation? Can I let you take this and I can speak of the work we're doing on that front after?
Yes, you mean the question on psychology or on carbon footprint? Sorry.
The question on carbon footprint and methodology for calculating.
All right. Yeah. So I mean, right now there are a number of organizations that have already done efforts to calculate their carbon footprint, but they're relatively isolated in this exercise, and most organizations have actually not done it or not started it. So there are a number of issues here. There's first, setting targets on reducing footprint does mean for all organizations that are going to adopt this commitment to actually set a baseline against which to measure over time, and especially on carbon, but not only, if there's a quantitative target which is chosen. And we believe it should be at least 50% in the next 10 years. There's another issue, which is how can we help to make emerge, I would say, a standard methodology for the aid sector, which is actually meaningful to operations and which contextualizes also. So, of course, it must be based on international protocols, the GHG and others. But there are key questions that need to be addressed over the coming period, such as having, I would say, an emission factors base, which is more and more common to actually have comparable data between organizations. But also, I would say, key questions like how do you address cash distributions, how do you address other forms of activities and measure their impact, because there are real questions about how to do it. So we definitely would like to work with a number of partners to help make such a standard emerge progressively over the coming period.
Thank you, Bruno. If I can just add a few things to this and also speak to the question on typical targets and actions under the second goal. So we've been working at the ICRC to look into how the carbon accounting tool that we've developed for the organization could be made available to the wider sector once adjusted for the wider sector. So that's one thing we are actually working on, and Bruno is associated to that effort. But the idea behind this is very much to say we should not all be developing the same tools. If we can be sharing tools, and organizations that have been already taking steps in that regard are probably able to help others. So this is an exploration we're doing now in collaboration with a number of humanitarian actors. So we've been in touch with quite a number of humanitarian organizations to see what are the needs and how do we adapt the tool. Now, turning to the question about targets, we would not yet be in a position to say what are typical targets because we've just opened for adoption. So we're not yet clear on what will be the typical targets. The ICRC, when adopting the charter last week, did share its target on the reduction of our emissions. And the target that we've adopted as an organization is a reduction of 50% of all emissions, so direct and indirect, by 2030, with a baseline that is 2018. We do expect that a number of organizations would have a 50% reduction target by 2030. At least this is what emerged in the consultations we were having, with the caveat that a huge number of organizations do not yet have a baseline. And this will have to come into play when we're looking at those targets. We are developing a website now for the charter, and there will be a list of signatories and a list of the targets that have been shared publicly by signatories. So there is a point where we will start to see what are the trends that are emerging in terms of targets that are being adopted, not only in terms of CO2 emissions, but also under the other commitments that are presented there. I think there was a question about the role of psychology in work related to climate and the environment. I'm happy to hear anyone speak to this. I think the only thing I would say there is that it's very clear that in all regards, we're speaking of a change in mindset. And this very much connects to the way we live, the way we think, and therefore there is surely a key role in understanding what are those mechanisms that are at play when we are looking at the way we live our lives, the way we carry out our work, and so on and so forth. David, Martin, Bruno, did you want to add anything to this while I scroll down, or you might already want to answer some of the questions I've not yet read?
Thanks, Catherine. I mean, I guess there's a question in here that comes from the live stream, I guess, about a concern about whether these sort of international pledges end up meaning anything at the local level. I think that's a major concern for us, and it was really important for us that this charter be something that's shared. As Catherine Lune mentioned at the beginning, we worked at ICVA was really critical for us as a partner so that we could reach out not just to the sort of big Western NGOs or the UN agencies, but we could reach out to local NGOs, community-based NGOs, of course, our own members, Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, and try to design something that isn't just for internationals with local responders also tacked on, but that is equally relevant. Whether you are big and international, or whether you are big and national, or just a community-based organization. And it is a shared humanitarian charter, and that is the goal here. And so we hope and expect that this will be a kind of commitment that the whole sector can take, from the community level to the global level. And we've also included within the text there this very strong notion that we need to support local leadership as part of both doing a better job of integrating climate into our traditional programming and greening ourselves. Or back over to you, Catherine or Todd.
Thank you so much, David.
May I add to that just to express the importance of this charter. So in your introduction, Catherine, you mentioned that there is this global crisis and we have to do our part. In a way, I think the world is also recognizing more than ever before that we are at the front lines of this crisis. So it is already affecting our work. We want to do our part, but the world is also almost looking at us as offering something special, being able to make that contribution in these really difficult places. That is different from making a contribution to your carbon footprint if you're living in Geneva, for instance. But it's still important, very, very important symbolically, that we make that contribution as well. It also means we're able to manage risks in places where the risks are probably highest, and also where few others are able to actually help reduce those risks. So I think there's a much bigger appetite globally for the humanitarian community to indeed step up. I think there will be support for us as a community to do that. I think we have to be vocal that that support is also something we expect, because we are at the front lines of something that is coming our way, that often also the people that we're serving in those different places have actually contributed the least to, compared to some of the countries that have had the most greenhouse gas emissions in the past and are actually suffering as well, but much less than these highly vulnerable communities. But we have something very special to offer being in these places. Now, once again, as David said, that also means connecting to the realities in those places and also empowering people in those places, which is why I think this charter is so exciting as something for us as a community as a whole, but very much also embracing that critical piece that local organizations and local stakeholders will need to bring to the table. So indeed, all of your contributions will be welcomed and critical.
Thank you so much, Martin. I think we have to close in 20 seconds. So I can only echo what Martin was just underscoring now. One last point I'd like to make is, I've said it when starting, although this was led in terms of development by the Red Cross, Red Crescent, it is for the Red Cross, Red Crescent, but it's for the wider humanitarian sector. And this is very important to bear in mind, because our sense was we need to be working collectively to address this crisis, and collectively goes beyond the movement and captures the whole of the humanitarian sector, recognizing that we also need to work with others. But it's very important, that idea of a collective effort. I think we're being shut off. Thank you so much for being here with us.